The evening sky had just begun to darken when a respected community college professor finished wrapping up his last faculty meeting. He gathered his worn leather briefcase, filled with student papers he planned to grade over the weekend, and walked through the nearly empty parking lot to his car. The cool autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as he climbed into his well-maintained sedan, one he purchased to mark his 10th year of teaching. Just 3 blocks from campus, red and blue lights suddenly flooded his rearview mirror. His heart sank, not from guilt, but from a familiar weight of anxiety that had become all too common in such moments. He did everything by the book, turned on his interior lights, kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over smoothly to the rightmost lane. 2 officers approached his vehicle, one on each side. Their flashlights beamed through his windows, momentarily blinding him. The professor remained calm, his voice steady as he greeted them with the same respectful tone he used in his classroom. "Good evening, officers," he said, hands still firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. "License and registration," the officer on the driver's side demanded, his tone sharp and unnecessarily aggressive. The professor noticed the officer's hand resting on his holster, a detail that made his stomach tighten. "Sir, may I ask why I'm being pulled over?" he inquired politely, maintaining his composure despite the growing tension. "Just give us your documents," the second officer interrupted, shining his flashlight directly into the professor's face. The professor could feel his heart racing, but his voice remained level. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but I believe I have the right to know why I've been stopped." The situation quickly escalated as both officers took his reasonable question as a sign of non-compliance. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer commanded, his hand now gripping his holster more firmly. "Sir, I've done nothing wrong," the professor responded, still maintaining his dignified tone. "I'm simply asking to understand the reason for this stop." By now, passing cars had begun to slow down, their occupants watching the scene unfold. A few students from the nearby coffee shop recognized their professor and pulled out their phones, sensing something wasn't right. The professor could see their concerned faces in his side mirror, adding another layer of emotion to an already complex situation. The first officer reached for his radio, calling for backup as if this simple traffic stop involving an unarmed educator somehow warranted additional police presence. "Last warning," he barked. "Exit the vehicle now, or we'll remove you ourselves." The professor, still clutching his steering wheel, took a deep breath. In his mind, he could hear his father's voice from years ago. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay calm when others expect you to lose control. He had taught hundreds of students about civil rights and constitutional law, and now he found himself living through exactly the kind of scenario he discussed in his lectures. As more patrol cars approached with sirens wailing, the professor made a conscious decision. He would handle this situation not just for himself, but for every student who had ever sat in his classroom learning about justice and dignity. He didn't know it yet, but his next actions would transform this moment of potential tragedy into something entirely unexpected, something that would ripple through their community in ways no one could have predicted. The red and blue lights continued to flash against the darkening sky, casting strange shadows across the growing crowd of onlookers. The professor's hands remained steady on the wheel, his mind clear despite the chaos unfolding around him. This was more than a traffic stop now. It was becoming a moment that would test everything he believed in and taught about civil rights, human dignity, and the power of choosing wisdom over anger. Following the officer's commands, the professor slowly stepped out of his car, the gravel crunching beneath his polished dress shoes. The night air had grown colder, or maybe it was just the chill of uncertainty running down his spine. His tie, perfectly knotted just hours ago, while preparing for his faculty meeting, now felt tight around his neck. "Hands where we can see them," the first officer commanded, his voice echoing through the now quiet street. The professor complied, raising his hands slightly above his shoulders. The second officer moved closer, his flashlight beam dancing across the professor's tweed jacket. the same one his wife had given him last Christmas, saying it made him look like a proper academic. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for," the first officer stated flatly. The professor couldn't help but notice how vague that explanation was, something he'd heard too many times before. "Officer," he began carefully, his educator's voice remaining steady, "I'm a professor at the community college just 3 blocks from here. I'm heading home from a faculty meeting. I'd be happy to show you my faculty ID." The growing crowd of onlookers had their phones raised, recording everything. Among them, the professor recognized several faces from his morning lectures. He felt a complex mix of emotions. Embarrassment at being seen like this by his students, but also a strange sense of responsibility. Here was a real-life lesson unfolding before their eyes, more powerful than any classroom discussion could ever be. "Stop talking and put your hands behind your back," the second officer demanded, pulling out his handcuffs. The metal clicked cold against the professor's wrists, and he could hear the murmurs of disapproval from the crowd. One of his students called out, "That's our professor. He hasn't done anything wrong." The first officer began searching the professor's car, rifling through his briefcase filled with student papers marked with encouraging comments in red ink. Lesson plans for next week's civil rights discussion scattered across the passenger seat. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. As the officer searched, something unexpected happened. He pulled out the professor's faculty ID card, and for a moment, his stern expression flickered. The younger officer stared at the ID photo, then at the professor, and something changed in his eyes. A flash of recognition that went deeper than just matching a face to a picture. The professor watched the officer's reaction carefully. There was something familiar about the young officer's face too, something that tugged at his memory from past semesters, past lectures about justice and civil rights. The tension in the air shifted slightly, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The crowd had grown larger now, their phone lights creating a circle of artificial daylight around the scene. Cars slowed as they passed, some people parking nearby to join the group of witnesses. The professor stood quietly, his dignity intact despite the handcuffs, watching as more backup patrol cars arrived with flashing lights. Through it all, he maintained his composure, remembering all the times he told his students that true strength often shows itself in moments of powerlessness. He thought about his next class, wondering how this experience would reshape his teaching. Every moment, every detail, would become part of a larger lesson, one that couldn't be found in any textbook. The night had become something more than a simple traffic stop. It was turning into a moment that would test everything this educator had spent his life teaching others. As he stood there under the streetlights, still handcuffed but unbowed, he didn't realize that his response to what happened next would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone watching, including one young officer who was about to remember something important from his own past. The air grew thick with anticipation as the young officer kept glancing between the ID card and the professor's face, like someone slowly waking up from a dream. The next few minutes would transform this seemingly routine police stop into something nobody on that street would ever forget. The young officer stood frozen, staring at the faculty ID card in his trembling hands. Memories flooded back, not of suspect descriptions or police protocols, but of classroom discussions about civil rights and justice. 3 years ago, he had sat in the back row of this very professor's class, sometimes struggling to stay awake after his night shifts at the local warehouse, where he'd worked to pay for his education. "Sir," the young officer's voice cracked slightly, catching the attention of his senior partner. I was your student." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The professor looked closer at the officer's face, past the uniform and badge, and suddenly remembered a passionate young man who had written an essay about wanting to change the system from within. The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The senior officer looked between his partner and the professor, confusion visible on his face. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his hand still resting near his holster. "He was my ethics professor," The young officer explained, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. He taught us about exactly this kind of situation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The professor stood quietly, still in handcuffs, watching his former student wrestle with the reality of their roles in this moment. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the street, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the murmurs of the gathering crowd. The professor's shoulders ached from the uncomfortable position of the handcuffs, but his expression remained calm and thoughtful. He could have been angry, could have shouted about injustice, but he saw something more important unfolding, a teaching moment more powerful than any lecture he'd ever given. "I remember you," the professor finally said, his voice gentle but clear enough for everyone to hear. "You wrote about wanting to make a difference in law enforcement, about bringing compassion to the badge." The young officer's face flushed with recognition and something that looked like shame. The senior officer shifted uncomfortably, realizing the situation had changed in ways he hadn't expected. The professor's students in the crowd had lowered their phones slightly, watching their teacher demonstrate in real life the principles he taught them in class. "Sir," the young officer turned to his partner, "I can vouch for this man's character. He's not just a professor. He's someone who taught me what justice really means." His hands moved toward his keys, ready to remove the handcuffs that should never have been there in the first place. The professor felt the metal loosen around his wrists, but he didn't move immediately. Instead, he looked at his former student with the same encouraging expression he'd worn so many times in class. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the most important lessons come when we least expect them." The crowd watched as the young officer struggled with his emotions, visibly torn between his training and his conscience. Some of the onlookers were still recording, but now they were capturing something different. Not another story of conflict, but a moment of unexpected connection and understanding. The senior officer finally stepped back, holstering his weapon. The professor rubbed his wrists gently where the handcuffs had been, but his focus remained on the young officer who had once been his student. In that moment, they weren't just a police officer and a suspect, or even a student and teacher. They were two human beings caught in a system that needed change. As the tension began to ease, the professor saw an opportunity that went beyond his own situation. He saw a chance to turn this moment of confrontation into something meaningful, something that could ripple out beyond the street corner and touch lives they couldn't even see. The night air had grown colder, but nobody in the crowd seemed ready to leave. They sensed that something important was about to happen, something that would transform this potential tragedy into an unexpected lesson about humanity, dignity, and the power of education to bridge even the widest gaps. Instead of walking back to his car, the professor did something unexpected. He turned to face both officers, his hands now free, but his purpose clear. "Would you both be willing to talk with me for a moment?" he asked, his voice carrying the same warmth he used in his classroom. The crowd watched, phones still recording, as this simple question changed the entire mood of the scene. The young officer looked at his partner, then back at his former professor. "I think we should," he said softly, remembering countless classroom discussions about building bridges instead of walls. The senior officer hesitated but eventually nodded, more out of curiosity than agreement. The professor gestured toward a nearby bench, illuminated by the street lamp's gentle glow. "When I was teaching," he said, looking directly at his former student, "we talked about moments exactly like this one. Do you remember that day when we discussed how fear can make us forget our shared humanity?" The young officer's eyes lit up with recognition. "The case study of community policing," he replied, his voice growing stronger. "You asked us what we would do if we found ourselves on either side of a situation like this." He glanced down at his badge, then back at his former teacher. "I never thought I'd be living that lesson." The senior officer watched this exchange with growing interest. He'd been on the force for 15 years and had never seen a traffic stop turn into anything like this. The professor noticed his attention and included him in the conversation. "Officer, how long have you been serving our community?" he asked genuinely. Surprised by the question, the senior officer straightened up. 15 years, he answered, his defensive tone softening slightly. The professor nodded thoughtfully. That's a long time to protect and serve. You must have seen a lot of changes in our community. As they talked, the tension in the air continued to dissolve. The professor shared stories about teaching students from all walks of life, including many who dreamed of becoming police officers. He spoke about the hopes they carried and the fears they faced. The senior officer found himself sharing his own experiences, the good and the challenging moments of his career. The crowd had grown quieter, moving closer to hear this unexpected conversation. Among them, current students watched in amazement as their professor turned a potentially dangerous situation into a moment of learning and connection. Some had lowered their phones, too engaged in the real-life lesson unfolding before them. The young officer spoke up again, his voice stronger now. I remember you telling us that the hardest moments often carry the most important lessons, he said. But I never really understood what that meant until tonight. His hands, which had earlier held handcuffs, now gestured expressively as he spoke about his journey from student to officer. The professor listened intently, nodding at times, asking thoughtful questions at others. He treated this moment not as a confrontation to win, but as an opportunity to understand and be understood. The senior officer found himself drawn into the discussion, sharing his perspective on how policing had changed over his years of service. Several patrol cars that had arrived as backup began to quietly leave the scene. The red and blue lights that had earlier cast harsh shadows now seemed unnecessarily dramatic against the backdrop of this peaceful conversation. Even the night air felt different, carrying the sound of genuine dialogue instead of confrontation. The professor's briefcase still lay open in his car, student papers scattered across the seat, but somehow that didn't seem important anymore. What mattered was this moment, this unexpected opportunity to build understanding between people who might otherwise have remained divided by fear and misunderstanding. As more people gathered to listen, the street corner had transformed into an impromptu classroom. But unlike any traditional lecture, this lesson was being taught and learned by everyone present. The professor's calm dignity, the young officer's honest reflection, and the senior officer's growing openness were creating something powerful. A real example of how change begins with conversation. As the conversation deepened, someone in the crowd started sharing the video online. Within minutes, it began spreading across social media, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected. Instead of another viral video of conflict, this was something different. A moment of genuine human connection that made people stop and think. The professor noticed more of his students arriving, drawn by urgent text messages from their classmates. They stood quietly, watching their teacher demonstrate in real life the principles he always talked about in class. One student whispered to another, "This is exactly what he meant when he told us about turning difficult moments into opportunities." The young officer, still processing the strange turn of events, shared something he'd never told anyone before. "You know, after I graduated from your class, I kept your final essay question pinned to my locker at the academy," he admitted, his voice carrying a mix of pride and vulnerability. The one about what justice really means in everyday situations. The senior officer, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "I've been training new officers for 7 years," he said, shaking his head slightly. "But I've never seen anything like this." He gestured at the peaceful scene around them, so different from how it had begun. "Maybe we need more moments like this." A local news reporter had arrived, attracted by the unusual gathering. She stood at the edge of the crowd, notebook in hand, realizing she was witnessing something more meaningful than a typical police incident. The professor noticed her but continued speaking naturally, his focus remaining on the genuine conversation at hand. "When I was your age," the professor said to the young officer, "my father told me something I've never forgotten. He said that the true measure of a person isn't how they act when things are easy, but how they handle moments that test their character." He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. "Tonight has tested all of us, hasn't it?" The crowd murmured in agreement. Among them stood a city council member who had been driving by and stopped to investigate. She listened intently, her mind already working on ways to transform this spontaneous moment into lasting change for the community. The senior officer, who had initially called for backup, now found himself calling dispatch again, but this time to report something very different. Situation resolved positively, he said into his radio, catching the professor's eye as he spoke. Actually, more than resolved. Something good is happening here. The young officer stood up suddenly, an idea lighting up his face. Sir, he said to the professor, would you consider helping us? We have these community outreach programs, but they're not working as well as they could. Maybe with your experience. He trailed off, looking hopeful. The professor smiled warmly. Sometimes the best classrooms aren't classrooms at all, he replied, gesturing to the street corner where they sat. If you think I can help build bridges between the police and our community, I'm willing to try. More people had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of police officers and civilians engaged in peaceful, meaningful dialogue. The street lights cast a gentle glow over the scene, and the night air carried the sound of genuine conversation instead of sirens and shouts. The city council member stepped forward, introducing herself. This is exactly the kind of initiative our city needs, she said, looking between the professor and the officers. Would you all be willing to share this story at our next public safety meeting? What had started as a tense traffic stop was transforming into something much bigger, a catalyst for real change in the community. The professor looked at his former student, now in uniform, and saw the same eagerness to make a difference that he'd noticed years ago in his classroom. As midnight approached, nobody seemed eager to leave. This moment felt too important, too rare to end. The professor's simple choice to respond with wisdom instead of anger had opened a door that many thought had been permanently closed between law enforcement and the community they served. The next morning, the professor walked into his classroom as usual, but something was different. The students were already there, waiting eagerly, their usual morning sleepiness replaced by excited chatter. The viral video of last night's events had spread far beyond their small community, touching hearts and minds across the country. I saw what happened last night. One student spoke up as the professor set down his briefcase. My mom called me crying after watching the video. She said it gave her hope. Others nodded in agreement, their phones still buzzing with notifications as the story continued to spread. The professor paused before starting his usual lecture. Should we talk about what happened? He asked, though he already knew the answer from their eager faces. The scheduled lesson plan could wait. This was a teaching moment too valuable to miss. One student raised her hand. You've always told us about choosing wisdom over anger, but seeing you actually do it. She stopped, emotion catching in her voice. It changed how I think about everything you've taught us. The classroom fell silent as the professor walked to the whiteboard. Instead of writing down the day's topic, he turned to face his students. Last night wasn't just about me and those officers, he began. It was about choices we all face when confronted with injustice. A knock at the classroom door interrupted his words. To everyone's surprise, the young officer from last night stood there in his uniform, still on duty, but with purpose in his eyes. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but I needed to say something to your class. The professor welcomed him in, and the young officer stood before the students, his hands clasped nervously behind his back. 4 years ago, I sat where you're sitting now, he began. Your professor taught me about justice and dignity. Last night, he taught me again, but this time on the streets. Students pulled out their phones, not to record, but to put them away, recognizing the importance of this moment. The officer continued, his voice growing stronger. What you saw in that video, that's the kind of officer I want to be. That's the kind of person I want to be. The professor watched his former student speak, feeling a different kind of pride than he'd ever experienced in his teaching career. This wasn't just about one night or one incident anymore. It was about the ripple effect of choosing understanding over conflict. The police chief called me this morning, the officer shared, looking at the professor. He wants to start a new training program. He said we need to learn what you teach here, not just in theory, but in practice. His voice carried both excitement and responsibility. A student in the back raised her hand. Could we be part of it too? Could students and officers learn together? The idea sparked immediate interest, with more hands shooting up and suggestions flowing freely. The professor stepped back, watching his current and former students bridge gaps he'd spent years teaching about. The classroom had become more than a place of learning. It was turning into a laboratory for real change. The young officer's radio crackled, calling him back to duty. But before leaving, he turned to the class one last time. Your professor taught me something years ago that I finally understood last night, he said. He said that real strength isn't about power over others. It's about the power to bring people together. As the officer left, the buzz in the classroom grew. Students were already forming groups, planning ways to support the new training initiative. The professor watched them with quiet satisfaction, knowing that this energy, this desire for change, was the real lesson of last night's events. One student stayed behind as others filed out after class. Professor, she said softly, my brother's joining the police academy next month. I was worried about how it might change him. But after seeing what happened last night, I think there's hope for change. The professor nodded, gathering his papers. The classroom slowly emptied, but the spirit of possibility remained. What had started as a tense traffic stop had become a spark for transformation, proving that sometimes the most powerful lessons happen outside the classroom walls. 1 week after the incident, the local community center buzzed with activity. People from all walks of life filled the meeting hall: students, police officers, community leaders, and concerned citizens. The professor stood near the podium, watching as his former student, the young officer, helped direct people to their seats. The police chief, a man who'd seen 30 years of change in law enforcement, opened the meeting. What happened last week could have been another tragedy, he began, his voice carrying decades of experience. Instead, it became a turning point. Today, we're here to make sure it stays that way. Local news cameras rolled quietly in the back as the professor stepped up to speak. He didn't use prepared notes or fancy words. Instead, he spoke from his heart, sharing his vision of a community where understanding replaced fear. That night could have ended very differently, he said. But sometimes, the hardest moments give us the greatest chances to change. A mother in the audience stood up, her voice trembling slightly. My teenage son wants to be a police officer, she said. But I've been scared for him, scared of how the job might change him. After seeing that video, for the first time, I felt hope. The room fell silent, absorbing the weight of her words. The young officer shared his perspective next, his uniform crisp, but his manner humble. A few years ago, I sat in this professor's classroom, thinking I knew everything about justice, he admitted. Last week taught me that I'm still learning. We all are. His honesty touched something deep in the room. The senior officer who had been present that night surprised everyone by speaking up. In 15 years on the force, I've gotten used to seeing situations go bad, he said. What I saw that night was different. It showed me that maybe we've been handling things wrong all along. A high school student raised her hand. In school, we learn about civil rights history like it's all in the past, she said. But what happened last week, that's current history. That's change happening right now. Her words sparked nods of agreement throughout the room. The meeting transformed into something more than just talk. People began sharing ideas, forming committees, and making real plans. The police department committed to a new training program, combining the professor's teaching methods with practical police work. Community members volunteered to participate in ride-alongs and citizen advisory boards. A local business owner stood up with an offer to help. My store can be a meeting place, she said. A neutral ground where officers and community members can get to know each other as people, not just uniforms or faces on the street. The professor watched as more hands went up, more voices joined in. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about a community deciding to write a new story for itself. The young officer caught his eye from across the room and smiled, remembering their classroom discussions about making real-world change. An elderly man who'd been quietly listening spoke up. "I've lived here 60 years, he said, his voice carrying wisdom earned through decades. "I've seen a lot of promises about change, but this feels different. This feels real." The meeting ran long into the evening, but nobody seemed to mind. People exchanged phone numbers, made plans, and formed connections that crossed the usual boundaries of age, race, and profession. The professor's simple choice to respond to confrontation with wisdom had sparked something bigger than himself. As the meeting wound down, a young girl approached the professor with her mother. "My brother got stopped by police last month," she said softly. "He was scared. I want to show him your video so he knows things can be different." Her words reminded everyone why they were there, not just to talk about change, but to make it happen. The community center slowly emptied, but the energy of possibility remained. The professor gathered his things, watching as officers and civilians walked out together, still deep in conversation. What had started as a tense traffic stop had grown into a movement, proving that sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest moments. 3 months after that fateful night, the changes in the community were impossible to miss. The local coffee shop, once just a place to grab a morning drink, had become an unofficial meeting spot where officers and residents gathered for weekly coffee with cop sessions. The same street corner where the professor had been handcuffed now hosted monthly community forums under the open sky. The professor sat at his usual table in the coffee shop, grading papers, when the young officer walked in, off-duty, and carrying a thick folder. "You won't believe these numbers," he said excitedly, sliding into the chair across from his former teacher. "Complaints against officers are down 40% since we started the new training program." A group of teenagers at the next table looked up with interest. They recognized the officer from his regular visits to their high school, where he now led discussions about police-community relations. One of them waved, and the officer waved back, a simple gesture that would have seemed impossible just months ago. The police chief had become a regular visitor to the professor's classroom, not to monitor or intimidate, but to learn and share. Today, he stood before a packed lecture hall, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "When I first joined the force," he told the students, "we were taught that distance keeps us safe. Now I understand that connection is what really protects both officers and civilians." The local news station arrived to film a follow-up story. They found more than they expected, not just statistics about reduced tensions, but real stories of transformation. The camera captured a scene at the community center where officers and residents worked together, planning the next neighborhood safety initiative. "It's not just about avoiding confrontation," the professor explained to the reporter. "It's about building relationships before confrontation can happen." He gestured to a wall covered with photos of recent community events, picnics, basketball games, and workshop sessions where officers and residents learned from each other. The senior officer who had been present that night approached the professor after a training session. "My daughter saw the video," he said quietly. "She told me she was proud of how I've changed since then. That meant everything to me." His eyes showed the depth of that personal transformation. At the police academy, new recruits now watched the video of that night as part of their training. But they didn't just watch. They discussed, debated, and learned from it. "This is what real strength looks like," the instructor would say, pausing the video at the moment when tension could have exploded, but instead dissolved into understanding. A local church opened its doors for monthly dinners where officers and families shared meals together. Children who once crossed the street at the sight of a uniform now high-fived officers they knew by name. The fear that had divided the community for so long was slowly being replaced by something stronger: trust. The professor's former student, now a respected officer and community liaison, started a mentorship program pairing veteran officers with teenagers interested in law enforcement. "We're not just training future officers," he explained during a presentation. "We're building bridges that will last for generations." One evening, as the professor left campus, he noticed a police car pulling someone over near the same spot where his own story had begun. But this time was different. The officer approached with respect, explained the reason for the stop clearly, and treated the driver with dignity. Small changes, but they meant everything. The city council recognized the impact of these changes by allocating funds for more community programs. "What happened that night showed us what's possible," the council member said during the budget meeting. "Now it's our job to make sure these changes become permanent." Back in his classroom, the professor added a new question to his final exam. How can one moment of choice change an entire community? His students now had a real-world example to draw from, proof that the principles they discussed weren't just theory but living, breathing possibilities for change. As evening fell, the professor stood at his classroom window, watching students and officers chat casually in the parking lot below. The barrier of fear that had once seemed permanent was dissolving, replaced by something he had always hoped was possible: genuine human connection. 1 year after that transformative night, the community gathered in the city park for a special celebration. Families spread blankets on the grass. Children played basketball with off-duty officers, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. But this wasn't just another community event. It was a celebration of how one moment of wisdom had changed countless lives. The professor stood near the makeshift stage, watching as his former student, now promoted to community relations sergeant, organized the youth volunteers. The young officer caught his eye and smiled, remembering how a simple traffic stop had set them both on an unexpected path. "My son used to want to be a police officer," a mother told the crowd during the open mic session. "Then he became afraid of the police. But now—" She paused, wiping away tears. "Now he wants to be like the professor, someone who can change things from the inside out." Her words touched everyone present, showing how deeply the changes had reached. The police chief stepped up to share some remarkable statistics. "Last year, we had the lowest number of complaints in department history," he announced. "But more importantly, we had the highest number of positive community interactions ever recorded." The crowd applauded, but they weren't just celebrating numbers. They were celebrating relationships that had been built. A teenager took the microphone next. "6 months ago, I got pulled over for the first time," she said. "I was terrified. But the officer treated me with respect, explained everything clearly, and even asked about my college plans. That's the kind of change we're talking about." The senior officer, who had been present that night, now led the department's new training program. "We don't just teach procedures anymore," he explained to a group of interested visitors from other cities. "We teach understanding. We teach dignity. We teach the kind of wisdom that turns confrontation into conversation." Children ran around wearing junior police badges, not as symbols of authority, but as signs of connection. Their parents watched without fear, knowing that the uniforms in their community now represented protection and respect rather than threat and fear. The professor's classroom had become a regular stop for police academy trainees. They sat among college students, sharing perspectives and breaking down barriers that had seemed permanent just a year ago. "This is where change begins," the professor would say. "Not in policies alone, but in understanding each other's stories." A wall of photos at the community center told the story of the past year. Images of joint workshops, sports events, and everyday moments where officers and residents worked together. But perhaps most touching were the pictures of simple conversations, proof that the biggest changes often start with the smallest gestures. The young officer's promotion ceremony had been different from traditional police events. Instead of just fellow officers, the room had been filled with community members who had become part of his extended family. They celebrated not just his achievement, but the new way of policing he represented. As the sun began to set on the celebration, an elderly man who had lived in the community for decades stood up to speak. "I've seen a lot of changes in my time," he said, his voice carrying years of wisdom. But this is the first change that feels like it will last, because it didn't come from the top down, it grew from the heart up. The professor watched as officers and residents shared meals together, children played without fear, and teenagers discussed their futures with the same officers who now mentored them. The physical handcuffs from that night had long since been removed, but more importantly, the invisible barriers that had divided the community had also fallen away. A young girl approached the professor with a drawing she had made. It showed police officers and civilians holding hands in a circle. "My teacher asked us to draw what community means," she explained proudly. "This is what I see now." Her simple artwork captured everything they had worked to achieve. As the celebration continued into the evening, the professor realized that the true lesson wasn't just about police and community relations. It was about how one person's choice to respond to difficulty with wisdom could spark a chain reaction of positive change that continued to grow and transform lives long after that initial moment had passed.